James, stop hassling Neil, because look at the lengths he's going to avoid your notification.
I think maybe the media, particularly here in the UK, has given the impression that schools are closed, whereas actually for a lot of teachers their working hours have increased and it's been even harder than usual.
Welcome to Hello World, a podcast by educators interested in computing and digital making in the classroom. I'm Carrie-Anne Philbin, a computing educator, YouTuber, author and Zen master.
And I'm James Robinson, a computing educator, trainer and advocate for effective pedagogy in the classroom. I'm not quite a Zen master yet. If you want to support our show, then subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a 5-star review.
Today, we're talking about well-being, specifically our everyday digital well-being. And I think whilst technology has been super useful for us as teachers, it helps us, communicate with our students really quickly. It helps us talk to our colleagues. It helps us stay connected with our friends and family. Sometimes those connections can sort of blur the lines between kind of home life and work life. So today we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit more and have a bit of a chat with some guests who are real sources of knowledge on all of this stuff. But first of all, James, I've got a question for you. What is one of your favourite digital tools that helps you stay connected at work?
That's really interesting. I've just come back from a period of leave, actually, so I'm sort of reacquainting myself with a couple of these tools. But we tend to use Slack a lot, internally, and that's really useful for keeping in touch with my colleagues and team members, particularly now as we're sort of all remote working, and that's really useful. And then I think a lot of the time I'm using Twitter to communicate with people out there in the community, and both of those are really great tools. And over the last 5-6 years, I think I've really kind of learned to use those effectively. I think one of the challenges with both of those things is sort of the ever-present nature of them. They're always there. It's always possible to be contacted. I turned my phone on during the week and somebody had tagged me in a post. It had nothing to do with me, but I had like 25 notifications and none of them were anything. So it's just like little things like that. You're trying to kind of switch off and relax, but suddenly you think, oh, something's happening and I need to respond or be involved, and you don't need to, and you should be switching off. And I think that's one of the challenges that I find with those sort of technologies. And I think a lot of them have really useful features, but I think what it comes down to is sort of me as an individual. I think I'm learning to kind of have discipline with those tools and use the features and take advantage of those features so that I can switch off and step away and mute notifications for a period of time.
Notifications, they can be, I think, like such a source of anxiety and pressure, to respond immediately. It's kind of the immediacy of like someone has messaged you either via Twitter, via Slack, via an email, or any of the other social media platforms that exist, and you sort of feel a pressure, and I know I do, to sort of respond immediately, whether that's 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, whether that's 5 in the morning, because of course I'm awake, I have a toddler, or in the middle of a day or in the middle of a meeting. And I think all of that is just sort of pressure that I don't really need.
I think, yeah, and you mentioned pressure. I think something that I've realised I particularly struggle with at times is prioritization. And I think when you get a notification like that, it can suddenly just jump up your priority queue when actually it probably shouldn't. And I think that's one of the sort of, there's this moment of, I need to deal with this now. This is the priority. And actually, most of the time it isn't. And it can sit a bit lower in your priority stack.
Yeah, and oddly, when I was teaching, I used to use email a lot with my students, especially my students who had like coursework elements or they wanted to submit assignments. I used to use email, found it a really good way so that the students felt able to, submit their work to me when it was useful for them. And I was able to kind of tag them and put them into kind of groups together so I could see where all that marking was. And then I was able to kind of schedule that marking. So there were things about it that were really great. And yet I didn't really feel that pressure that I do, I guess, when I'm working with colleagues. I didn't really feel the same pressure to respond immediately. I felt like actually that tool was really useful. But I guess it's just the notifications that are coming from colleagues where you feel like you have to respond immediately, that is kind of where that pressure is coming from.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think, particularly in the classroom, email was almost more immediate than you needed it to be. Often you wouldn't be responding during your teaching lesson. You might get to the end and go, "Oh, have I missed anything? Oh, there's an email about wet play today," or something like that. Or, and you could then respond at the moment. Nothing really was more important, more pressing than what was going on in your classroom at that moment. So it was harder for it to kind of grab your attention in the same way.
Well, luckily, we've had some great educators write about this for Hello World magazine. And in issue 13, Learning Under Lockdown, our next guest gave some real practical advice on digital well-being when teaching, specifically remotely, because it was about kind of how teachers were adapting during the pandemic, which here in the UK, we were under quite strict lockdown rules. But I think a lot of those tips and advice are just useful generally. So I'm really pleased to say that Neil has joined us. He is a senior lecturer in computing education at the University of Hertfordshire. He is a computing at school community leader and the founder of Computing Champions. Why do you think it's important for educators to think about how they use technology effectively?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie-Anne, and thanks all for inviting me today. So, as you mentioned in your introduction, this stuff is increasingly part of our lives. It's essential for banking, communicating, and that device you got in your pocket actually is probably your clock as well. You need it for those really simple things. So we're constantly getting it out to look at, and it's always with us. And as James mentioned, it's really, really difficult to take a break from these devices. They can be particularly addictive. It can be that we're not able to actually put them down. And then we also see, oh, I've got a message. I need to respond to that. I need to do something about it. And Karen, you mentioned that in your introduction, but also when we send a message as well, we might have a bit of anxiety there. Oh, did I say the right thing? Are they going to respond? So we sort of got double-edged sword here. It can be really sort of quite a worry for us as well. And this sort of intrusivity, if that's a word of the devices, the research says that it can take us up to 25 minutes to actually regain focus on our work when we are distracted. And if we've got a lot of these distractions during our working day, suddenly we might lose half a day's worth of work just through that refocusing of tasks. And I think linked to all of this is our increased usage of social media, which has increased during the pandemic. And having that filtered, perfect view of people's lives perhaps isn't particularly good for our well-being either.
It's really interesting, Neil, that you pick up on the anxiety caused maybe by sending as well. Like, everyone's working slightly different hours nowadays as well. Like, and so, I might be working, but my colleagues might not be. And so there's also that anxiety, am I going to interrupt their family time or their tea time, or are they even working yet? And I guess, we know that lots of teachers have been working from home due to the pandemic. And what effect do you think this sort of has had on their well-being, the sort of digital impact of them working at home?
Yeah, this blurring of boundaries between our home and work life is really, really tricky to manage, particularly if we maybe haven't got a dedicated space for our work, and also we're having to use our own technology, which perhaps we might want to use for something that's a bit more enjoyable than our work, for example, but it's still sat there maybe with our work emails pinging in whatever hour it is. I think maybe the media, particularly here in the UK, has given the impression that schools are closed, whereas actually for a lot of teachers their working hours have increased, and it's been even harder than usual to balance their various commitments, particularly if they've got family members at home that they've also got to try and homeschool while teaching themselves. And then finally, because the technology is always with us, it means that perhaps we give the impression that we're always contactable, and that might include by parents as well. And for the first time, actually, parents are maybe observing all our lessons being taught, and also the input that we're giving to children. And that's potentially a scary thing. I mean, as educators, we're very used now to being observed regularly, but whether that's from little Johnny in year 5's parents for 24 hours a day, but certainly from the hours of 9 till 3, I'm not sure that's perhaps a good thing, particularly if I'm being asked to use a new bit of technology that I'm not that familiar with as well, which has been a worry for a number of teachers too.
I hadn't even thought about that idea of sort of, parents also observing your lesson. If you do switch to delivering lessons remotely, yeah, you do have that extra layer of parents kind of hearing you teach, which is added pressure. And that is, actually quite terrifying. That's actually really terrifying. I hadn't even thought about it. So, what can teachers do to kind of help mitigate against, some of these issues?
Well, I think with the parent observation thing, I know some schools have sort of included that into their homeschool agreements as well, that actually how you respond to teachers. I think for individuals, that managing of notifications, as we mentioned earlier, is really important, particularly using features of the devices such as do not disturb, or maybe just turning off the notifications for certain apps. I know I've got a pool app on my phone that wants me to engage with some person that I haven't spoken to since I left school 25 years ago, whatever it was. And actually, I probably don't need that in my life. So to get rid of those kind of things, and also consider when we can leave the device at home, or if we go for a walk, or if we're watching TV, actually, do I need this thing near me? And interestingly, Google has brought out a paper phone where you can wrap your digital device with a paper wrapper around it, so it's there in case you actually do need it for an emergency to make a phone call, perhaps if you're out on a hike, for example. But your normal access to it is then restricted, and it can even actually print out on the back your calendar for the day as well if you want.
James, stop hassling Neil, because look at the lengths he's going to avoid your notifications.
Well, interestingly, the only work email I received this weekend was from Mr. James Robinson. I wasn't sure who he was, actually. A few other bits related to this then. Actually, the digital device doesn't have to be your clock. I know when I'm teaching now, I actually put on a physical watch, which is about the first time I've done it in about 15 years, but because I know I was using my phone as the clock, glancing at my phone, someone tagged me on Twitter, that's really exciting, I've got that dopamine hit, I want to engage with it. No, Neil, you're teaching. Actually, I want to do a decent job teaching, and also I want to engage with these people that are in front of me. Going back to the homework boundaries side of things, if we can have a separate area dedicated for work, that's great. I appreciate that's not always possible, but even if it's simply putting a laptop away at the end of a day, for example, closing your books, putting them in a bag, that physical process of I am now finishing work and going to do something else can really help too. And while we are perhaps at home more, actually think about our physical health as well, if that's getting a decent chair, a desk, and exercising too, to actually make sure that's getting some endorphins flowing, and where we're not solely rooted to the spot, particularly if we might be used to, say, going to visit colleagues or walking around a classroom, which we would usually do.
So you remind me of when I was training to be a teacher. I had this. I was working at a school. I was training at a school called Barking Abbey in Barking in Essex, and one of the senior members of staff there, he gave me this tip, which I have kept with me for life, both within teaching when I left teaching. And that is, he said to me, Carrie-Anne, whatever you do not take work home with you. He was like, if you have to stay in school until 6-7 o'clock to complete your marking and do your planning on one day, he was like, do that. Whatever you do, don't go home at sort of 3-4 o'clock, have your dinner, and then try and do that work after that. He said, because what you're doing is it's going to take you, you're sort of switching off and then switching back on again. It's going to take you longer to actually complete that work. It's better for you to just stay at school, get that work done, get it done in the school building, because that is the place where you work, so that when you get home, home is home. Appreciate it's difficult right now with these sort of blurred lines we've talked about with sort of the pandemic and lockdowns. But I still think the same principle applies. I try and keep my work in a specific room or set of rooms. And then I go and, I eat my dinner in a separate room. I have my family times in separate rooms. Or, if hopefully people were lucky enough to have multiple rooms to be able to do that. But it just feels like that tip has really set me up for life.
Yeah. And I know that when the few times that I do have to sort of continue my work, perhaps into the evening, the quality of my interaction with my family during that dinner time isn't as good, because I've no constantly in the back of my mind, actually, I've got to go back and work. I'm not switched off, relaxed. So I think it can potentially sort of make things work. But make it more challenging, perhaps.
Well, thanks, Neil. That was super interested. We're also joined today by Kat Lamin, a computing educator and consultant who has been instrumental in bringing teachers together to talk about their well-being. She hosts a global GEG staff room meetup online called Mental Health Matters twice a month. What inspired you to take action?
It was really early on in the pandemic, and I'd already met some global educators around the world. We were talking about what people can do, and I could see my friends sharing out lessons and sharing ideas and talking about best practice for teaching during the pandemic. And I was sitting there thinking, what can I do? What can I do? And something I've been doing for the last few years has been talking about my own personal mental health. So I first started talking at PyCon UK. I did a presentation about what it's like to suffer from depression. And I thought, well, actually, hearing my friends talk, seeing all the tweets, there seems to be a lot of people both putting themselves under pressure and being put under pressure. And there's no outlet for it because, normally when we're in a school, we walk into the staff room, we sit down and we unload a bit and we'll have a grumble or we'll have a celebration even. We'll talk about what's gone well. And that didn't exist when we were all sat at home, teaching through a screen. So I had this idea and I floated it with my friends and said, what do you think about opening up a staff room, just having a Google Meet or Hangouts as it was called then, opening it up to anybody who wants to join. So we did that. And I think we must have had about 20 people the first time. We were originally doing 3 a week. That lasted a couple of months. And then I dropped down to 2 a week and a lady called Leslie Altman took over one for Australia on Thursday mornings, which was Thursday evenings for her. What we found was really powerful because people felt they had that opportunity to talk about what's going on in their country, their location, what's going on in other locations, how they felt. And it was, what was interesting is we started doing some things like I had a rubber ducky scale. So, if you want to look it up, just Google rubber ducky scale. And it's this giant rubber duck that starts off big and full of energy and eventually deflates and crashes into an island. And I just said to everyone, what number are you? What do you feel like? And people who'd been chatting away quite happily, quite normally, suddenly sort of said, oh, I'm a 9, which is the duck that's sunk under the water. And when you ask why, oh, well, actually, I can't cope. I'm struggling at the moment. I feel like I'm underwater. They came across absolutely fine and absolutely normal. And that was a really interesting and sort of telling moment for me. And we realized that people needed that outlet. And it's been really interesting because we've been going for over a year now with the staff rooms. And the amount of times people have just said, oh, I'm just here to listen. I just want to hear some friendly voices. And they'll just sit with their camera and microphone off listening to us talk. And we'll talk about anything. So sometimes we'll talk education. Sometimes we will vent about how rubbish everything is around us. And sometimes we'll talk about shark being fish and chips in Australia and what flavour ice cream is the best. So it's a really, and it's such a lovely community. I count these people around the world as my friends now. I've got, Fons in Texas. I've got Leslie in Australia, and these people we chat to, and we chat once every few weeks at least.
And it's interesting, Kat, you started off by kind of like, sort of looking to or seeking to kind of replace that staff room feel that's very much an in-school kind of thing. But now you've got educators talking to people from outside of their school, from beyond their school community. Why do you think it's particularly important for people to reach out beyond their immediate community?
I think it's very easy when you're looking at your own community to not appreciate what you're doing well, actually. Like there's a few schools I work with now as part of my consultancy work, and they keep saying, oh, we're not doing very much, we're only doing, and then reel off a million wonderful things they're doing, and they think that they're not doing very well. And it's like, you're doing these wonderful things. You're recording lessons, you're doing live lessons, you're looking after your children, you're contacting parents, you're doing all these wonderful things above and beyond normal teaching, as well as still supporting the children in the classroom, and you don't think you're doing much. So that's been really powerful in itself. And then on top of that, it's just understanding what's going on in the rest of the world. I think it's been really eye-opening to help us see beyond the pandemic as well.
I think there's something in that. I think I always felt as a computing educator that there was, it's a relatively isolating role because you're often a very small department or small team, small team. The pandemic particularly has everyone's looking because we're in this sort of not normal kind of period. No one quite knows what the norm is and whether what they're doing is above the average or below the average or just about right. And so there's been lots, I think, of looking at the practice of other people and seeing how they're responding, which is great for inspiration, but it also means that there's inherently a bit of a comparison going on. Oh, they're doing so much more than I am, and they're doing so much less, and I think that it's just really interesting to have people connect with other educators and sort of comparing their experiences.
Yeah, it's been, and one of the things that came out really early on, because a lot of the people who were in the part of this community do tend to be computing teachers or digital technology specialists, people who are involved with technology in the school. And one of the things that happened quite early on was they had that sort of effect where the teachers were stressed and overwhelmed, and the teachers who aren't technologically proficient, people would come to them and be like, "Why haven't you shown us this already? Why aren't we already know? Why don't we already know how to do that?" And they were getting everything dumped on them. And what we found with Staff Room is, because we were all talking about this and we all had the same experience, everyone was able to sort of say, "Okay, it's not just me then," and we could look at the bigger picture and appreciate, okay, these teachers are being unreasonable, but they're stressed and they need someone.
So imagine some teachers who perhaps, they're not used to going outside of their classroom. Perhaps they're new teachers. Perhaps they're just a little bit tentative. What is a really simple, kind of low effort way to start to build a support network outside of school?
I think it's really important to look at things like social media. I know we talk about the notifications and the stress factor, but one of my friends, Alfonso Mendoza, a guy in Texas, he talks about his personal learning family. And he's got a podcast, My EdTech Life, all about my personal learning family, because he thinks it's more than a network. It's friends and people you look up to. And I do think it's quite important that you connect with those educators who hold similar values or similar positions to you, to get inspiration, get ideas. There are a few Facebook groups, but again, it's within reason. Let's not get obsessed about checking it. Don't compare yourself to other people. One thing I find a lot of teachers aren't confident in doing is admitting that they're struggling or asking for help, and that's what we sort of foster a lot with the Staff Room. Please let us know. No questions too stupid. It doesn't matter if you think this is a thing you should already know. There's a Facebook group I'm part of, which is for UK primary school coordinators, and it's a really nice group because there are a lot of new people that almost regularly someone comes in and says, "I'm a new computing lead. What do I do?" I know James is a member of that group too, because I bullied him into joining. It's really nice because everybody jumps in and says, "Oh, look at this, look at this. Why not look at this?" And so that's been really useful to join those groups and find the ones that help. There are a few groups for Google educators out there. The UK group, a global group, and nobody's going to criticize you for asking a stupid question or a question that you think is stupid. Because the thing that people don't often realize is you might be wondering that, but so is everyone else. You're not alone. So I think that is quite a powerful way to get involved and way to build that network. I'm seeing a lot lately, actually, a lot of people putting out tweets saying, "Here's what I do, who should I follow?" And the trouble with that, though, is you get the trap of people just listing everyone they've ever met.
And that's something that's been really helpful recently. I can't think, there was something recently where I tweeted a question, and I can't even think what it was now, Kat, but you were like, I know the 5 or 6 people that James wants to hear from, and you just went and tagged them all, and they all responded. And so I think it's finding the right and the most appropriate people to talk to on social media, and finding those little kind of those spaces where you can chat with individuals is really useful.
But I also think it's about, as Kat has mentioned, sort of sharing, asking the question, who can help me? This is what I'm doing, or I'm working on. Who can help me with that? Or sharing something that you've done. I think where we see some of the best communities build, particularly in computing education, is when people sort of share ideas or tips or best practice. And I see that so much in things like Kaz Chat on Twitter, or the Kaz forums, or within Hello World magazines, just places in which people can say, look, this is the thing that I'm doing in my classroom. Maybe it's useful for you, and maybe it's not, but I just think that helps build those relationships in a way that's really useful, and it stops that sort of imposter syndrome a little bit.
One of the things I find absolutely fascinating is one of my most popular tweets last year was telling people that you could change the end of a Google Slides URL from /edit to /present. And, that's something I consider to be quite basic, but hundreds of people, as it turned out, didn't know that. So you'd be amazed at what simple things people don't know or people can help you with.
And so how can people how can listeners find your online meetup or find out more about what you're doing, Kat?
So for Global GG, for the staff room, I tweet about it from my personal Twitter when it's on. There's also the Global GG website. There's a Global GG Twitter and Instagram, and that's actually GG stands for Google Educator Groups. And that was sort of group of educators again around the world. Global GG just formed off the back actually of staff room, and educators around the world now just offer completely free training on the website. It's lovely. But don't hesitate to get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at Kat Lamin, and I'm always willing to help and listen. I've also got a website I've been developing, but I haven't done much work on lately, which is mentalhealthineducation.com. And the idea behind that is to give teachers an opportunity to share their mental health journeys. So there's about 15 stories on there at the moment from educators talking about what they've struggled with in terms of their mental health. And it's fascinating to me because some of them started off with mental health issues and left their job and joined teaching and found that lifted them. And some of them found teaching caused mental health issues. And some of them just happened to have mental health issues that coincided with teaching and wanted to talk about how that affected their performance as a teacher.
And I'd like to bring Neil back in now, if I can. And you've listened to sort of Kat talk about, teachers connecting globally, online, and finding ways to sort of share how they're feeling. What advice do you have to help computing teachers approach their digital well-being?
Well, I think for a lot of computing teachers, they're used to delivering sessions on online safety and how to make sure your devices are set up correctly, and also make sure these notifications are not pinging at every hour of the day, but to actually practice what you preach and put this stuff in play. And if perhaps then other teachers see you doing it as well, that's really going to help. I think it's also important to consider if you're doing activities that are similar to those you might undertake in the classroom, such as programming or making activities. Is it as your hobby, or is it for work, or is it a bit of both? And that crossover perhaps isn't always easy. I think a lot of computing teachers, we're makers, programmers, geeks, whatever you want to call it, at heart. Do consider, is this a work thing I'm doing, or is it for my personal enjoyment? And then finally, with the social media engagement, actually, if we're engaging with work people on Twitter, that's probably still considered as work. So it might be a time where we maybe think we're switching off and we're not. And that engagement, when we want to, perhaps is absolutely fine. But I think it's worth considering, actually, is this the kind of thing I want to be doing at this particular point?
I think that point you mentioned there, Neil, about the programming and making, and work, I can definitely relate to that. And I often quite, like talking to my family, James, are you doing that programming thing, that making thing, that soldering thing? That's work, right? And I'm like, oh, no, because it's fun. I'm enjoying it. It's like, well, no, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I can be having fun and doing work, but if it's work, you should count it as work. And I think that's really tricky to kind of sort of untangle those two things. And sometimes I use it as, I know that I've used it as an argument to myself. I've convinced myself this is fun, that's why I'm doing it, not because I feel obliged because it's work. But it's a difficult sort of trap to get out of.
Yeah, I know at the minute I'm doing Harvard CS50 Introduction to Game Development course, and it's completely self-guided, and you in theory do it whenever you want. But because I maybe see it as more fun than work, it inevitably eats into an evening and weekend, and I'm finding that really difficult to balance actually at the minute.
And this is a question to both of you, but a thought that kind of struck me, and maybe we don't really know the answer to this yet, maybe there's just not enough research, but I was thinking about how the well-being of teachers might impact on students and the attainment of students. Do you think that's the case?
I strongly believe that a happy teacher is going to be a better teacher. Realistically, if your mental health is struggling, then how are you going to support the mental health of your students? I think as educators, the vast majority of us are hugely empathetic, and we naturally care about the students we teach. But if you're struggling, if you're overwhelmed, then you're not going to have time to put that care and consideration into your students, which is, of course, going to negatively impact how you're teaching, how you're able to support them. And it's so important that schools and senior leadership in particular think about teachers' well-being, so that if they're supported, then that will support the students as well.
And I certainly agree with Kat there that I think if the children realise that perhaps you're not giving them the same reactions that they respect when maybe they give a response to a question, they might become concerned or maybe even anxious, or that could impact on their behaviour, and perhaps the classroom dynamics might change there.
I think just all those we've talked throughout this our conversation about lots of little times where maybe you're distracted by a notification, you're working during personal time, and I think all of these things are occasions where you might not be giving your work your all. Like, you're distracted by something to go and respond to a tweet, or you're giving a really quick rapid response to a notification that comes in. And I think in all of those occasions, it's possible you may not be making the best decisions, or making quick decisions, and so I think not only is there possibly a bigger kind of macro effect on the students, but also just those little tiny moments where you're not fully engaged in work, you may not be making the best choices, the best decisions that may come to kind of.
Yeah, it was super interesting. I really want to thank both Neil Rickus and Kat Lamming for joining us today to really talk about well-being in teaching, and do check out Neil's article in Hello World about using tools effectively for your digital well-being, and also check out all of the links that we've put in the show notes so you can see how you can engage with Kat's work. And so we decided to put the question out to you, our listeners. How are you managing your digital well-being? Nicholas Provenzano messaged us to say he makes things, whatever he can think of, woodworking, coding, gaming, whatever helps him keeps his anxiety down is how he manages his well-being.
And there were also lots of comments about outside, just getting outside and enjoying being outdoors and reconnecting with nature. So Amanda Hawes, who we spoke to in one of our first early episodes of the podcast, said that she started walking more, both their sort of local neighborhood walks, but also discovering new places they'd never been before, and really kind of that nature and exercise had been really good for their mental health throughout this period.
And we also asked, what strategies do you use to create boundaries between home and teaching? And Spencer Organ tells us that he has a home office in which he and his wife, they use it, and they only ever do their schoolwork in that room. Once the door closes, schoolwork remains in there, particularly email, which I never check on my phone. And I have to say that is a top tip, Spencer, because I've also recently learned to turn off my work email on my personal phone.
It's a really good tip, and I think I'm going to probably be following suit as well. I think things like Slack and Twitter, they're quite useful for immediate notifications, but I don't need email on my phone. It's a very similar comment, in fact, but just sort of highlighting the fact that it doesn't need to be a separate space or room. You just need a tiny little office space, says Matt, who goes by Always Computing on Twitter, just to separate your work and your downtime in your head. It's about that mental separation.
What an interesting discussion we've had today about well-being. So, James, what did we learn today?
I think for me, it was that creating that sort of mental separation between work and home, however you do it, whether it's about the physical stuff, whether it's about routine, whether it's about notifications. I think that's a really important challenge for all of us at the moment, is to make that mental separation between work and our personal life. How about you? What did you take away from the conversation?
So I've learned there's possibly about 6 ways in which I can block someone called James Robinson across all my communication devices. So I'm going to go away and do that.
Well, I'm going to go research some more ways to bother you. So there we are.